Great. Okay. So I'm just here to give you a bit of a context on like why you're here doing this housing production strategy right now. And so as you probably know, goal 10 is one of our statewide planning goals. It's a housing goal. It's been around for a long time, for about 40 to 50 years. Planning for housing has been all about, projecting your population, projecting your housing need, inventorying your buildable lands, and then accommodating that needed housing through either a UGB expansion or upzoning within your UGB urban growth boundary, sorry. Or, maybe finding that you have enough buildable lands for accommodating that housing. So, this is the approach that Sandy used back in 2017 when you did expand your urban growth boundary. You found that you did need more land for that. And so, this is kind of the framework that you all utilized. But in 2019, the state legislature, kind of facing in the state, we're facing rising housing costs and a housing shortage. And so the state legislature passed House Bill 2003, which changed, how Goal 10 works, basically. So that statute or legislation does three things. It directed the Oregon Housing and Community Services and DLCD to come up with this statewide program methodology called the Regional Housing Needs Analysis, and I'll talk more about that later. It kind of required cities over 10,000 in population to do the housing, to analyze their housing needs on a schedule instead of just as as they wanted to. And then it also created a new element called the housing production strategy. And you'll hear me say a few times tonight, housing production, affordability, and choice. And so those are kind of like the three big components of this new framework of for this whole state of Oregon. We are focusing on not just housing production, but also affordability and choice in all of our communities. And so this slide displays, sorry, I need to adjust my screen so I can even see my notes. Thanks. Okay, so this slide kind of depicts the Goal 10 requirements, the new Goal 10 requirements. But I'm going to talk about the housing production strategy, which is kind of where you are in the process. You've adopted your housing capacity analysis already. The housing production strategy is basically an 8-year action plan that contains a set of specific actions, tools, and policies to address the housing need that you found through your housing capacity analysis. So a few things to know about the housing production strategy. One is that DLCD reviews the housing production strategy. Once you adopt it locally, your staff will submit it to DLCD, and we have 90 days to review that. We can approve with conditions, or remand that. We just started doing this because all this is so new. We just started doing that work last year when the first set of cities adopted their housing production strategies. All of them were approved or approved with conditions. And so, we post them all on our website. We have a comment period, a public comment period for each of those, and then we write up an approval kind of report for those. So we review the document to basically ensure that it meets the goals of the statute, that it meets those goals of housing production, affordability, and choice. The main components of your housing production strategy, kind of what we'll be looking for, is data, right? Using data to better understand the housing needs of people in Sandy. Engagement, the statute requires you to engage with community members, producers, and consumers, I believe is the terminology used, of housing, to inform kind of the actions in your plan or your strategies. And then, of course, the strategies themselves are the heart of the document and kind of the time frame for each of those. So what do you plan to do over the next 8 years, and when do you plan to implement that?
Hey, Kelly, I have a question here from one of the
Yes, thank you, because I can't see anything except myself. And go ahead.
Two things. First, if we could get these notes that she's kind of referring to, that would be helpful because I just have the screen slides. But if you could just zoom up on your notes, you talked about, do you need data to assess the housing demand,
Oh,
right? What it was?
you can see my notes. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, those are just my own notes, but so they might not be written in a way that was meant for your consumption, but hopefully they are fine.
I mean,
Because some of them are reminders. Yes, so the data is really, I'm talking about, and I think Beth will talk about this, the contextualized housing needs. So it's like everything you did in your housing capacity analysis, all that data that you collected, and then as well as any new data that's added by your consultant team, Beth and Nicole, and then any like qualitative data that you collect, right? You're talking to folks, right? You're talking to people in the community about what they think Sandy's housing needs are, and so that's what I mean when I say data.
What we just talk to people in the community about what they think housing needs are.
We're gonna cover that when we do our
Okay.
presentation. We'll talk to you about the stakeholders.
Yeah. I wonder if I can. Is that better? Now are you seeing my notes still?
That's perfect. No.
Oh, well, there we go. Okay, interesting. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I think I've covered everything here. Oh, one last thing. So so you see the little green icons here for the housing production strategy, and the second one says reflect, measure, and report. So there is a midterm checkpoint. So after you're 4 years in, so 4 years from now, or from 2025, so 2029, there'll be like a midpoint check-in where you report on how it's going, like what strategies have you implemented, how have they gone, and if it didn't go as planned, like, what's your plan B, or can you do something different? And then every year, every city is reporting their production to DLCD. So as you issue building permits, and then as those building permits get finalized and like you issue the occupancy, that data will come to DLCD. And so we're actually working with another agency on a dashboard, an online dashboard that will show all of that information from all the cities throughout the state, and how that's working. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But really, what the statute calls for and what DLCD will be looking for is do the strategies in your HPS address the housing need that you found when you did your housing capacity analysis and housing needs analysis. And so it says contextualized housing need. I try to avoid using that term because it's a little bit wonky, but really, are your strategies addressing the need that you found in Sandy? So if you found a need for, workforce housing or accessible housing, do you have strategies in your plan that are going to, address that? And then also, again, I'm not going to read all of these bullets, but, taken together as a whole, each, however many strategies end up in your final housing production strategy, when you kind of look at them all together, are you going to achieve, fair and equitable housing outcomes? So do they address housing production, affordability, and choice? To repeat that once more. So one last thing I want to mention is the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. I'm sorry. I'm working and I need you to go in a different room. Go.
We've all been there.
I'm very sorry. Get her out of here. Can you shut that? I'm really sorry about that. It's dinner time at my house.
We get
Okay.
it.
So, and I can't find my mute button either, so. Okay, so the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So in addition to, you know, changing how kind of what we do for goal 10, the legislature said, DLCD, you adopt some more, change your rules, update your rules on all of this to kind of fully implement this program. And so we are working on that right now. It's called the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, or ONA. So we have 3 topic areas that we're working on. I think the important thing to know for the city of Sandy is that you are working under 2 days rules. And even though we are adopting new rules and they will be adopted, some of them will be adopted on January 1st of 2025. You don't have to worry about that with what you're currently doing. You're kind of since you already started, you're working under those current rules. When Sandy will, you know, need to look at these new rules that we adopt is in 8 years, you know, when you do your second housing production strategy in 8 years. So that first topic area of housing needs and production, that's kind of like, how do you do a housing production strategy? So you don't have to worry about that now. You're already doing it under the rules we have today. The second bucket here, where I have the yellow arrow pointing up, that's housing acceleration. So this is something that will affect Sandy over the next 8 years. So when you do that midpoint check-in, you know, you'll be working under the new rules that we're adopting. And so that's really about how we're measuring progress. And then it creates a housing acceleration program. So for cities that aren't really making much progress or aren't really implementing their housing production strategy, that's where DLCD will be able to refer cities to the housing acceleration program and then connect them with resources and kind of do a deep dive and an audit and try to figure out what's keeping this city from really reaching its goals. And then the last bucket is for housing capacity and urbanization. So that's kind of about how we do the buildable land inventory and urban growth boundary expansion, if that's happening. So that's a third set of rules that we're working on. So we have draft rules that are out now. We have hearings coming up and public comment periods, and actually your staff has been in the loop, and we actually received comments already from Kelly O'Neill, so thank him for that. I know he's not there tonight, but so we're working on all of this simultaneously as folks are doing their housing production strategies and such. So I'll be here. I mean, this is all I have for you tonight. I'm happy to answer questions, and I'll stay on and listen in too if you have questions after Beth and Nicole talk to you. So thank you very much.
We'll be building on what Kelly just said, so we may well answer some of your questions as we go along.
Yeah, I have one question though. I appreciate that this is all very aspirational, and I get that this is kind of a canned thing that gets presented to every city. And yet I feel like I was kind of mouthing the question, does she know about our moratorium? And, you know, you're talking about in 4 years, we're going to grade you on how well you've done and all that. And it's like, this is the problem where we have, you know, local land use planning being done at a statewide level, because our interest in trying to solve the same problems that you're talking about cannot be done at the statewide level with one size fits all. And so I'm just trying to understand if you could just comment on something more specific to Sandy as to what your expectations are, given where we are with things right now and a moratorium on new development.
Right, absolutely. Thanks for the question. I am aware of the moratorium, and I've been working with your staff. So we've had a few conversations already with Jeff and Kelly and Beth, Nicole, about, you know, how Sandy's going to have a housing production strategy that probably looks a little bit different than other communities. And I think the key is that, you know, there's lots of ground, I guess, things that the city could work on to put in place, you know, zoning codes and programs and just things that you can kind of do in the next 8 years that maybe will set the city up for future production, you know, when your new wastewater treatment plant comes online. And so there's a lot of prep work that can support you later on. And then, you know, as far as the measuring your progress, I mean, those I understand that you have a certain amount of permits that can still be issued over the next several years. You know, there's a cap on that. And so, and that you have a lot of units that have been approved, but maybe haven't been built yet. And so you will be, you know, over the next few years, you'll be issuing permits and you'll be issuing certificates of occupancy and you'll be showing production. And so I think it's too early to say like how, you know, what you look like on the dashboard. But I will also say that, you know, when we're talking about like referring cities to the acceleration program, you know, that's it's going to be we're writing the rules about that right now, so I can't really say with any certainty exactly how that will work. But the comments that we received from Kelly O'Neill actually, you know, urged DLCD to, in the rules, somehow take into consideration like cities that are dealing with a moratorium and, you know, build in some sort of understanding of that. But really, I think the acceleration program could potentially be a good tool for any cities. Like it could be a way to connect you with state resources, right? To connect the city with the governor's office or Business Oregon grant programs to kind of help with your major need, which is, you know, the wastewater treatment plant, but you know, anything else that could help move the needle. You know, I want to say that I don't know if the rules are going to really specifically address like a moratorium situation. But you know, DLCD is only going to be able to have a certain number of cities, you know, that we're working with in the acceleration program every year. And I can imagine that there are going to be cities that have other issues that are more kind of, you know, more complicated. Your Sandy's big barrier, right, is you need money for wastewater treatment plant. That's it's not easy, but it's straightforward, right? And I think there are going to be cities that maybe don't have as straightforward of issues, and so those might be where DLCD might decide to spend more of its resources. And so I think that's all I can say about that at this point, given that we haven't finalized those rules yet.
Everybody good?
Okay, so my presentation builds off of what Kelly was just saying. And it's it's got a little bit of some of the same information in it, but not too much. So a housing capacity analysis and a housing production strategy, they build on each other. So we know from the housing capacity analysis about your buildable land, some about your housing market, your forecast of new housing, that kind of thing. In the housing production strategy, we refine that understanding of housing need. We update a little bit of the data. So things like housing sales price and rents, that kind of data changes very quickly. So we've updated that. And then we do some talking to stakeholders, which we'll talk about in a few moments, to make sure that the information we're getting from the data, which is census data as well as market data, to make sure that we understand what's going on in Sandy. And then we have been working with staff to identify potential action strategies. And that's what partially we'll be talking about tonight. And the first strategy is, you know, the first issue, the first barrier is really about wastewater. And the fact that you need, I don't know, the numbers keep going up. I've heard at one point 130 million. I'm sure it's more than that. So while it's a straightforward problem, it's a really big problem. And so Sandy can't really support a lot more housing beyond
Can we
what your current,
clarify?
I'm
It's
sorry,
Wastewater and fresh water. We
okay,
actually have two constraints that we're working towards.
okay. I've heard more about wastewater.
And it puts the price tag more than 200 million.
But we're having to, redo the hookup to the new Bull Run filtration plant and
Okay.
So we're capacity constrained.
that's a $1 billion
Right
project.
now.
And so you've got a certain number of ERUs that you have that you can use to support development of housing as well as other types of development in the city. And so over this next, I don't know, if it's 5 years, if it's 8 years, if it's longer than that, you're really going to be constrained in the amount of housing that you can have built here. So we're taking that into consideration. And quite frankly, whenever I get a chance to comment on these kind of things, how will this work, for different cities, I keep bringing Sandy up and saying, ginormous infrastructure costs, how is this be like Sandy's supposed to deal with this? And that gets attention. So the housing production strategy is really about actions. Our project schedule, our grant ends in May of 2025. So we will be finishing up the work by May of 2025. We may well we've got a separate contract with the city for presentations to the city council. So it may well be that one or more of our presentations to the city council is a little after May of 2025. So about contextualizing housing need, I'm not going to repeat a lot of the data that you saw last time because you've seen it from the housing production strategy. I'm sorry, you've seen it from the housing capacity analysis rather. So it's need for housing by income level, and it's also considering how needs are different for different groups of people. So people experiencing homelessness have a different need. People of color or in different racial or ethnic groups, their barriers to accessing housing are going to be different than the overall average. People over 65 years old and people with disability, they have a different set of barriers to accessing housing. In all of these cases, a lot of it's about affordability, and then it's also about accessing housing without discrimination, and then housing that meets the household's specific needs. So we've been having stakeholder discussions with the groups that you see here on the screen, and I'm not going to repeat all of that. I'm going to go through a little bit of what we've heard. If you have questions, Nicole's going to answer the questions because she's actually been talking to people. So what we're hearing is not surprising about rising costs of housing, utilities, and necessities that are really straining residents, particularly your young families, your single parents, your lower income workers, and your seniors on fixed incomes. Utility rates are another version of an affordability issue other than just rents and the cost of ownership. A lot of people need multiple jobs to make ends meet. So it's not just a 2-income household, but it may well be a 2-income household with people with more than one job per person. You're seeing increased demand for your support services like your food bank and your energy assistance programs. That's another way of looking at it and seeing that certainly some groups in your community are strained. And then some seniors, they just don't have the awareness or they face difficulties accessing support services, particularly when information is online. So having it online may well be a barrier. And these are community development sorts of issues. What we're also hearing is that Sandy has limited support for residents experiencing homelessness. And so those include local youth, lower income workers, and people on Social Security. I don't know if it's true or not, but there's certainly a perceived community resistance to services. And so certainly that's limited some of the services you have in the community. You don't have transitional and emergency housing here in Sandy. And so people who are experiencing homelessness or you don't have enough of it aren't able to access those resources here. And mental health stability is often a significant barrier to accessing housing. To the extent that you have people here with mental health issues, they're more likely to be experiencing homelessness. That's just generally true. when you look at houselessness.
Question, Beth,
Yes, ma'am.
one of the questions that's kind of come up that changes things is a couple of months ago, we had the county homeless coordinators and Nuba from Ant Farm here. And I asked, how many homeless do we have in Sandy? And they couldn't tell me. They said, and they said the last count was like 12. And so I'm just kind of trying to understand, as I understand it, there's been different definitions from different groups as to what's considered homeless and all that. So with regards to what you're talking about with limited supports, can you kind of clarify the intent of the definition you're using?
I don't think we're using a very specific and only definition of homelessness, because it does vary, because when you have people who are doubling up, so like people sleeping on other people's couches, that's a version of homelessness. If you had people, you don't have an emergency shelter, but if you did, that's a version of homelessness. Then you've got people who are unsheltered. And oftentimes those people are sort of extra hard to count. So when we're talking about homelessness, we're talking about sort of those broad definitions that could include any of those groups. Am I missing anybody?
I think youth as
Youth,
well,
yeah,
like the
yeah.
Ant Farm was specifically talking, and some of them, they are housed, they
Yeah,
are put
yeah.
housing, but they're considered part of this population.
Because they're couch surfing or sleeping where they can. And to
Yeah.
my knowledge, in that meeting, he said we have about 25 of those individuals.
And you get that information from the school district, so that's information that's a little more reliable, because the schools are able to track it a little bit better than you can track, homelessness more generally.
These themes, where did these come from? Like,
These-
where does this information come from?
This information is from those interviews, and so what I did is I took the interviews, and obviously the homelessness one came from more of Ant Farm and a couple of the other providers, and then I basically themed them up into what we heard for some of these different groups.
So it's you guys.
And you, some of what you
Might
said.
Hey, how
Thanks,
come,
that's helpful.
going back to your stakeholder side, why not some of the businesses that hire large numbers of people? Because that seems like it would have more to do with, is it creating a difficulty attracting people, keeping people, retaining? It seems like this is, just a thought on why it wasn't.
So to a certain degree, why not more interviews? It's about limited budget. And so we know from some of the data that we have about employment and wages, we know some things about wages for businesses, jobs in Sandy. And so we can tell that oftentimes people who are in service jobs, even if there's 2 service workers per household, they can't afford rent. So we have some information about this. A lot of this is information from groups that we just have no information about to speak of, or very little.
That doesn't make me feel very good.
Um,
It feels very circular, fulfilling, that you might find the answer you're looking for if you look that way.
Okay, so I think your feedback is, we should be talking to, some business, owners
Well,
and operators
not a
as well.
lot, but there's a couple of big ones.
Mhm,
The city's a big employer.
mhm.
The school district is a big employer. I think a couple of data points might be influential.
We'll take that back and discuss it with, Tyler and Jeff and Kelly. That's the name I wasn't getting, person who's not here.
Right. Beth, I have a question for you.
Yes.
I took a peek at Gresham's finished housing production strategy. And I noticed one of the things that they focused on, at least in theirs, was the income capacity and what I would call, they stopped at median income. So if you were between 80 and 120% of the MFI,
Mhm,
nothing above that.
yeah,
So everything is more or less focused on low or extremely low income.
I would
and
say call it
affordability.
middle and low and extremely low, yeah.
So any wage, any business wage higher than median average
Mhm.
would not be relevant to the housing production strategy as per the state guideline under that bill?
Well, I mean, when you think about, what are the barriers to housing? So you've got some barriers to producing any housing. So your wastewater treatment, problem, your water capacity. those are barriers to any kind of housing, no matter how much it costs. Then when you think about barriers to housing where you might make more public investments, that often points to that median household income or lower. The housing production strategy really focuses on the middle and lower income households. So what you need to get single family detached housing is often really different than what you need to get housing that is affordable at that middle and lower income groups. And so that's why it's focused more there.
But as a city council and as a city, aren't you looking at a bigger breadth when you're talking about land use? It's not just the low to mid
Yeah,
range when you have a captive land and you have to expand it. You really have to consider, okay, we want to use, and I'll just throw a number out, 64% of the land for that type of property. Then you can part and parcel that property for that function. But you have to also consider what you need for the other half or the other proportion, which I don't know whether it's a large proportion or a small proportion in Sandy myself. I'm guessing it's rather small, but I just don't know what the percentage is.
so I don't have the percentages right here because we cut that part out because we were trying to get to where we could tell you some of the actions that we're looking at. So the barriers to producing higher cost housing are, do you have enough land? We know from your housing capacity analysis, you have enough land. Is that land serviced? We know from the discussions that your water and wastewater services are a problem. Do you have the right zoning? And are there barriers in zoning? And so we'll be looking at zoning barriers in
When you go
this.
through that, okay.
We'll probably be talking to some market rate developers just a little bit later in the process to ask the question of, okay, these are the kind of strategies that we're talking about for market rate housing, which is the kind of housing that you're talking about.
Yeah,
Are we hitting things that would, if there was water and wastewater capacity, that would make it more plausible to build that kind of housing in Sandy? So we just haven't quite gotten to that point. We have to have some ideas before we can really talk to those groups of people. So,
I think it's important when we throw things out like wastewater barriers or even moratoriums to recognize that's a future event, not the current. So they're issuing permits and stuff, and I think, I'm just gonna ask you to be more precise when you discuss these things with us or anybody else that we're talking about now. What time frame we're talking about now? 5 years, 10 years?
so we are talking about what can be done in the next 8 years, very specifically. And it's not clear in any of the discussions we've had when your water, your wastewater moratorium could be lifted. That
Well,
hasn't.
it's also not clear in the next 8 years what developments will put in and ask for things either.
Well,
We have to make some assumptions, right?
well, we have made some assumptions in the housing capacity analysis about future growth. We know that if we looked at 20 years from now, if we looked at how growth looks in Sandy, I'm going to predict that it would be slower, in these out years, before you had your wastewater and your water issues taken care of. And then it will probably increase, at least for a while, after the moratorium is lifted, and you're able to have more development. What's it look like beyond that? Well, you'll have to do another housing capacity analysis in 8 years, so you'll be able to update that forecast and update what's going on with the current events. That's why it's important that this happens every 8 years.
Okay.
I guess the one thing that I would add to that though is, and I think we talked about it when you interviewed me, is just the fact is that, our utility bills are high and scheduled to go higher unless we can get, tens of millions of dollars dropped in our lap. And so we have to be realistic about that until we get manna from heaven type of thing. And so the concern that I have expressed to you all is the fact that, building more affordable housing, which then, those folks may want to, because they are low income, want discounts on their, entitled to discounts on their water and sewer bill, which then, then makes the other folks need to pay even more. And so this idea that we're trying to do a whole lot more affordable housing, but also pay these larger utility bills has to kind of factor into what our plan is for the future.
Yep.
What is, that, it's not just the infrastructure needs that we have in the moratorium, it's also the sustainable ability to pay the utility bills and, what kind of population can afford the utility bills and things like that, because it's real, we need a balance.
Certainly.
Yeah, certainly.
And what I would say is in 8 years, when you're looking at your, well, 7 years, when you're looking at your new target for development that you'll have from the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, that certainly should be a discussion at that point. So it's going to be really different than what we had going through this process.
How many of
So
those themes are different from the other dozen plans that you guys put together this year? Are they the same? Is there anything different from Sandy other than the infrastructure when we look at these bullets?
some of them are different. I mean, utility rates are certainly different. I don't
That's not an
know,
issue in the other cities.
well, it varies, but high utility rates can certainly be a way that you end up with slower growth over time, because your utility costs are higher. So if you looked at the work that we did in Gresham, for instance, it's got a different emphasis because the community in Gresham is different. If you looked at the work that we did last year in Newport, it's got a really different issue because their issues are different. Some of it's in common, it's partially about infrastructure, but it's very different reasons. So,
Some of the criticism of your outfit has suggested that the cookie cutter approach isn't customized nearly enough. And so I'm just trying to understand what's unique to us and not boilerplate.
well, to a large degree, the actions that a city has already done, and that a city can choose, those are certainly unique to each city. And different cities are choosing to do different things.
Okay.
So for instance, we were in Grants Pass last year. And I was talking to them about, oh, should you consider a GEO bond, a general obligation bond, to support housing development of middle and lower income housing development. And they were like, don't mention that outside this room, please, because you'll just get thrown out of the city. And in other cities, they're very much like, yeah, we're considering a bond. So, you want to go back?
Yeah, I would say that you're not wrong that some of these barriers are, like, some of the themes and the barriers are the same. I mean, when we talk to, I'm working with some other cities right now, and when we hear about some of the barriers for seniors and being able to age in place, like, they're not necessarily very different for some of these groups. In some ways they are. Utility rates is not one that I'm hearing in other cities, not to the extent that we're hearing here. But yeah, so I would say, like, I think there, especially when you look at the Portland Metro as a whole and just the housing costs in general.
So some of our colleagues work in places like Montana, in Washington and California. What I think you'd find is, generally speaking, it's not hard to go and name the barriers. The barriers are really similar in different places. There's different reaction from different communities. So.
Thanks.
All right, so developing the housing production strategy. So this is something that I think is really, important to consider, is that the city has a specific set of roles in development of a housing production strategy. And this is one of those that I've heard different cities considering their roles in a few of these things really differently. And I'll mention that in a few moments. So city has a lot of influence, more influence on public policy. So the zoning, the density, your design requirements, and for market rate housing, those things have to align to get market rate housing done, to allow a developer to build a profitable project. That has to have land with services at reasonable acquisition costs. When I've worked in Hood River, for instance, and in Bend and am I working somewhere else, that they were just talking about these McMinnville, the acquisition costs were just astonishing. The costs for the land. Market feasibility, you have to be able to achieve the rents and the sales prices to support a profitable project. And then capital, this is one that in Salem, some of the stakeholders were suggesting that a lot of cities, they don't participate much in the capital stack. In other words, a city isn't a bank. And we had some stakeholders suggesting, oh, the city should use its full faith and credit to back construction loans. To which I haven't heard from Salem staff, but I was thinking. I
Feels like an
wouldn't do
Enron
that.
solution down the road, you know.
Offer loans to developers. And I was thinking, I probably wouldn't do that if I was a city councilor, but some cities are willing to do it.
Yeah, for sure.
So, there's different ways that cities can have a different role in these types of things. And of course, you're not the only stakeholder in this. The federal and state government do a lot about funding affordable housing. The city of Sandy has its roles around public facility planning, zoning, funding from things like urban renewal, that kind of thing. And then there are other organizations in Clackamas County, which we've just listed a few of them, that have different roles. And so the city is one among many.
And I would add onto your previous slide, the circle one, when you're talking about affordable housing or, very low income housing, what you need with that is a component of services.
Yes,
And so that's
for
not.
some of that.
For
For some of that, so for permanent supportive housing, you certainly need services. For some low-income housing, you don't need as many services.
you need some, yeah.
There's some low-income housing that's just plain low-income housing.
Yeah.
That doesn't have any of the services that go with it.
So, but, especially for the
Yeah.
homeless and all that, a lot of services involved. And so
Definitely.
that's kind of what I'm talking about is that
Mhm.
that's kind of where this next slide that you just were on, when you talk about like the county and all that, that's kind of where I just feel like, we got our hands full. We're trying to run the two libraries for the county and the transit for TriMet going from
Mhm.
Damascus to Eagle Creek to Estacade, we're doing all this stuff for all these different places and we got our hands full. And so the idea that we could then take on services on top of all the stuff we have is just,
I don't
that's
think
what's
the
scary.
idea is that the city would have a role in things like mental health services or anything like that. The city might be a partner in certain ways, which I'll talk about in a few moments, in a nonprofit or the housing authority or whomever building that housing and then providing services through that. But I wouldn't imagine, I haven't seen cities get into things like mental health services, that kind of thing. What I have seen cities do is if they have land that is publicly owned land that isn't needed for other public uses, they can sort of put that into the kitty.
Yeah.
And that's the way they can partner. Or making sure that the design requirements have a path for letting that kind of housing be built, and that is acceptable in the community. I'm thinking about some housing in Eugene where I live. That is definitely that. It's simpler. It doesn't have a fancy facade or anything like that. It's that kind of thing.
It's just that sustainability of those services.
Mhm.
Is the county gonna keep funding, or whoever is supposed to be funding all this? Are they gonna, is this nonprofit gonna dry up and blow away in
Yeah.
5 years and then you're,
Then
kind of
what do you
stuck
do?
with the, right, and that's kind of my
Project.
concern,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
Mhm.
so.
We've got like
Okay.
one at a time and we
Go
still have 10 slides to get through, so.
All right, I'll go through them. So different strategies have different levels of impact. So the strategies that have more impact essentially are things that have to do with resources. Things like removing regulatory barriers or being a partner, they have in and of themselves less impact. But they're necessary, but not sufficient in themselves to support housing of the type that we're talking about, the low and middle income housing. None of the actions that we suggested in HPS, none of them are on their own. There's no silver bullet for this. We've been, constructing this problem my whole lifetime. So, 50 years and longer. It's going to take a while to, as a nation to unravel some of these problems. You've got a lot of existing things that you've been doing in Sandy that in the HPS, we essentially call it, you get credit for. So, you've allowed single room occupancies, you've got, ADU provisions, et cetera, et cetera. And so we acknowledge those in the HPS. And when we're doing that evaluation that Kelly was talking about achieving more fair and equitable outcomes, we talk about those things in there. You're already doing this, so you don't have to do it. You already allow ADUs, so you don't have to allow ADUs because you already do it. And that meets some of the housing needs that we're talking about. So as we're starting to think about different actions to include in the HPS, we're leading with the wastewater capacity limitations. We'll add the water capacity limitations there. Limitations on city funding and staff capacity, because you don't have a big staff to be able to execute on certain types of programs. High construction costs and financing costs are driving up the overall housing price nationwide. You guys can't control that. Limited funding is available to support development of affordable housing or rehabilitation, but there is some funding available, and can Sandy tap into that? Ensuring that higher density housing is in appropriate locations where you have access to services like transit, like grocery stores, medical services, those kind of things. And then preserving community character and safety while supporting homelessness services and affordable housing. So balancing those out, that's really where we're starting the considerations from. I'm gonna skip the barriers piece. When we talked to the service providers who we've spoken with, their suggestions were, can the city expand some involvement in human services, such as partnering with service providers to help them be able to provide their services more easily, and not the city assuming the provision of those services, but what can the city do to make it easier for the service providers. Offer rehabilitation assistance for homeowners or renters. Well, there's some state programs that are coming online or are already online. Can you tap into funds for that, where the city has more access to funds than necessarily nonprofits might? I believe that there's some county funding.
I'm going to just interrupt it because it was a surprise to me. The Sandy Community Action Center was not aware that we already do the utility and internet assistance programs.
Well, there's a thing that,
We just ended the internet packages.
What's that?
The internet one just expired.
Yeah,
there's a thing that is a little, that's easy to fix.
right. It's just communication because,
Mhm.
yeah.
Darn humans,
So,
they need the
yeah.
communication.
Yeah.
Suggesting supporting more rental housing development, whether it's affordable or market rate, and enhancing outreach about available resources. So essentially, to a certain degree,
Support, encouragement, I don't know what that means.
support or encourage.
What does that mean as a counselor?
Make sure you've got enough land zoned for it, make sure that you have, design requirements that, allow, for, multifamily housing. I don't remember what else they may have been suggesting in the support or encourage.
Some of the things that are already in
I
it.
have to look that up.
Some of the things that were on the other page probably start to check out.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then support development of transitional housing, and that kind of thing is probably going to be in partnerships. So is there an organization that you can partner with that hopefully will not evaporate in 5 years? Where the city can in some way help them with a little enhanced development process, give them more of a hand through that. Is there city-owned land, for instance, that kind of thing that could be put into the kitty to support that kind of development? So some of the things that we're looking at for actions are things like pursuing your wastewater facilities funding. I imagine that grant writing is going to be right in there in that action. Looking at financial resources to support housing development and preservation. So you could, as a city, have a construction excise tax, which is a tax of up to 1% on newly constructed housing, where that tax goes into a fund, and you have to use it in some specific ways for part of it, and you can use it more generally for whatever you consider affordable housing. Actually implementing that kind of thing would not happen in the HPS. It would be if we carried forward with it, an action that, the city would attempt to do at some point in this 8-year process. And when would you do it? Well, we'll be setting a schedule. And when I say we, I mean more staff and city council will be setting what that schedule is in the HPS. And so some things may be earlier than other things. I would imagine your wastewater facility work will be much earlier. Looking at urban renewal, and is there an opportunity in your urban renewal districts as they evolve for a set aside of funding for affordable housing? Well, that probably means some changes to your existing urban renewal plans, or if you're looking at a new urban renewal district, in that urban renewal plan, that kind of thing. That's very much a setup that's not going to yield money likely in the next, 5 years, but in the, 5 to 10 year range. Urban renewal takes a while to monetize essentially. Pursuing grants such as the CDBG grant from the county. There may be funds there that are available for some of these different sorts of things. Looking at development code changes. And these things, they aren't required by the state, but these are things that the city could choose to do. Things like allowing cottage cluster in more residential zones. Do you need short-term rental regulations? If you don't need them, I can't remember if you guys track short-term rentals.
We don't
But if
have.
you don't, maybe you want to
we
track
talk
them.
about it,
And monitor them so that, in 8 years, you know more about how many short-term rentals you have in the city. And, then if you decide that you should be regulating them, you can do it with information and you can collect transient lodging taxes more effectively. The state should be probably coming out with some pre-approved plan sets for accessory dwelling units and other types of housing. If those pre-approved plan sets fit with Sandy's character, can you adopt them and then allow them? And that lowers the cost of developing those kind of housing because the plan set's pre-approved. Can you do expedited permitting for income restricted affordable housing? You don't get a lot of that. But when you do, can you do some expedited permitting? Use of publicly owned land for housing.
Excuse me, is that faster than they've already kind of like taken it from 120 days to like, I don't know, 51? What was the new? They've really already cut it.
That is something that I need to talk to Kelly about.
Okay.
So I mean, we're talking about something that occurs once every 10 years, maybe?
Well, that apartment complex is going on in Bornstead.
That fell into this.
It falls
income
in-
restricted.
falls into this.
Okay. That's not a frequent.
No, it's not a frequent thing.
Once in the next 8 years, twice possibly.
And, if you can do that, faster, is that, perhaps going to give you a way to support that kind of housing development, just a smidge more.
Given our frequency, it seems like a low bang for the buck, but
It's also a low cost. That one's an extremely low cost. So, looking at the land that's publicly owned. I don't know how much land Sandy owns that's publicly owned, that's not a park or not a public facility. But things like that, talking to your partners, does the county own some land here? Does ODOT own some land here? I'm really hoping that ODOT at some point will start letting go of some of its publicly owned land for this kind of housing. I like to pick on ODOT. So these are the kind of actions. I'm paying attention to the time. And
You're
what we
doing
might
good.
ask you to do is perhaps to send an email to Kelly and or Jeff. If you have, potential actions that you think the city should be pursuing that we haven't included in here. Or if you think that there are actions in here that are just a bad idea, under no circumstances should we consider that. What we'll be doing is bringing back more information about these actions, because right now they're very brief statements, and they could mean a lot of different things. So,
we have a quick discussion. I know we're-
Yeah, no, yeah.
But
I just
the work session.
wanted to kind of, if we go over, obviously it's, it's an important conversation to have. So I just wanted to keep us mindful.
So I'll just, ma'am,
Please.
So some of these, if we can, some of these are expensive and probably not something we would typically think about. So I'm just curious, is there any support for council for pursuing things like dedicating money from the redevelopment agency for this kind of housing? We've never talked about it before. I'm just curious. This isn't a commitment vote, but I just wondered, is there support for that? Because I'm more inclined to adopt the things that we've already done, because I feel like we've made an awful lot of changes already. So to me, I don't want to go a lot further. I'm kind of in some modest improvements would be my take on this, what we should put into this plan.
I was gonna say, I line up with you, Don, except for what I'm hearing is, what I don't know about is what's available for the city to get as far as grants are concerned to help with affordable housing.
Yeah.
And that's what we haven't talked about.
If we put something into this, is if we get such and such, then we would do that.
Right.
You know, yeah, I'm cool with that. I just don't want to make some commitment to, and I don't want to commit something for future councils to say like in 5 years, we're going to do that tax thing. Well, that'll be a new set of councils and I don't know how we commit for them.
And so just so you know, if you commit to something and it turns out it's not feasible, like literally not feasible, or the council decides not to do it, what your obligation is at that point is to have a plan B. So what do you do instead of that? And what I will say is that at the state, and maybe the federal level, we'll see, funding options keep evolving. I think the state isn't paying enough attention right now to need for funding for infrastructure, for instance. And for all types of, affordable housing and that lower on up to the middle income housing. And so I choose to be a little optimistic.
At the end of the day, though, the HPS or housing production strategy is supposed to drive us towards meeting the housing capacity analysis needs assessment, or housing capacity needs assessment. Sorry.
Yeah.
Because that's the number that we're trying to achieve, that's our projection, and all the HPSs is our action plan to achieve that number. And oh, by the way, you need to do this every 8 years, because before you were taking 20 years between them, the state wants you to do them more frequently. The question I would have is how compromised are we to the things that we commit to in that HPS? So we say we want to do these things, especially given the moratorium that we're under, where we can't make those commitments. How do we make a commitment to do something that we can't commit to? Because we don't know how many hookups we're gonna have, and we don't know what that will be, and we can't project it because we don't know.
So we're not talking here about, most of what we're talking about is putting things in place to make it easier to develop housing, or to accumulate funds to support development of housing. I think it's very clear to everyone who has been involved in this project at the state, as well as at the city, and also with your consultants, that, I don't remember the number of units per year that Sandy's supposed to produce in the HCA, and it doesn't matter right now. You're gonna have a hard time achieving that over the next 8 years, because you have a very specific limit. And so we go into this knowing this, and we'll be saying that right up front in the housing production strategy. So it's about setting up the future and taking that time over this next 8 years to do the things that you can do of the type we're talking about here, even though it's only going to result in a certain amount of affordable housing production strategy in this next 8 years.
I understand what you're saying, but I really kind of side with Chris a little more, because I think the problem that I'm struggling with is you're asking us to make decisions when the DLCD is still making the rules that might put us on the naughty list or not.
Yep.
So I mean, we're already down this one list, right? We don't need to be on another to where the state just comes in and starts telling us how to develop even more. And that's my concern with everything that I'm hearing today.
So what I will say is the housing accountability, not HAPO, the other one, the housing acceleration program. There we go. From all I've heard, and a lot of cities are very concerned about this, is if you're not doing the things that you say you'll do in the HPS, then the question is, what are you gonna do instead? And what resources does the state have to help Sandy achieve some of these? And as a city councilor, I'd be saying, well, do you have $200 million, please?
I get that, but you're still asking us to make rules without that $200 million.
Mhm.
That's my
Uh,
biggest hangup, it's like literally, if they want us to come along, then we need the money.
So here's the deal.
Because I don't see this problem getting fixed in 8 years.
And our plan has to reflect this reality. If we can't afford to do the infrastructure improvements that we need,
Yep.
that limit is fixed.
Oh, yeah.
And that's where we're gonna be for 8, 10, whatever years into the future until that's.
And that's what your HPS will say.
And
So
so
I
if
just wanna
we have
make
very
sure
low
that
bar
we-
for what we say we're gonna do.
Low bar is the right answer.
A low bar for what we say we're gonna do because of all these reasons. And, I'm not saying. So if we have the low bar, then we're not gonna get spanked if we've achieved the low bar,
Well,
right?
the low bar is based on reality right now. I mean, to me, it'll be an interesting plan that we put in, because I don't think any other, your other communities that have gone in there are in the same situation yet, but.
Yeah, can we I was gonna say, can Kelly chime in
Yeah,
about
we
that?
gotta
'Cause we're
try to
kind of pushing
frame
it on
this.
you when it's really a her question.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kelly, can you know, I know you opened up with,
DLCD recognizes that Sandy has some challenges currently, and not everyone's HPS is gonna be the same, and there's gonna be, approved or approved with conditions. Is there a soft launch, like explore X, Y, and Z, or, some other?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. A lot of cities have individual strategies that are more like study the possibility of doing this, or explore this, or consider, evaluate whatever. And so those are necessary steps, right, to get somewhere. So I like the example that Beth used with the short-term rentals, right? Like short-term rentals, especially in Sandy, like you guys have a lot of tourism. And so the if people are using their homes as short-term rentals, then they're not available to for someone to live in. And so that it's possible that is, you know, driving up the costs and reducing the number of units in Sandy. And so, it takes time and effort to understand if that's a problem and start collecting data on that. And then if you decide you want to tackle it, then, coming up with some sort of regulatory process for short-term rentals, and then, adopting that and getting it all set up, like that takes years, right? And there are lots of great examples, especially out on the coast, of cities that have done that. But it was still, would take a while to set up. And so if you had a strategy that said, we're going to study short-term rentals, or maybe you have a little more certainty about that, and you're willing to commit now to, start limiting, short-term rentals in the city. And so then you take a few years to figure out how you do that, or in what way you do that, right? So, I think a lot of your strategies can be exploratory, but I will say what I've heard, and so it's the housing division at DLCD does the review. And I'm not part of the housing division, so I'm not part of that. I'm not going to review your HPS like myself, but it does have to address the need, right? So if your housing capacity analysis shows that you have a really large need for housing that's affordable to people that are making 60% of the median income, and your strategies and your HPS don't really get at that issue if they are not really targeted towards the type of housing that's going to be affordable for those folks, then that would be something that DLCD would flag and say, hey, you don't have anything in here to help support the creation of units that are deeply affordable. And we can certainly, make suggestions, and I'm sure that Beth and Nicole have some suggestions too, but your strategies have to address the need. So if they don't, then that would be a reason for DLCD to remand it. And we haven't done that so far with any HPS that's come before us. But the last thing I want to say to answer this question is that, we do, like, DLCD's funding this work right now. So we're giving you grant funds that the legislature gave to us for this purpose to pay for this HPS work in cities. We hope that because the legislature wants all the cities to then implement their housing production strategies, that we will continue to get the grant funding that will make it possible for us to give you money to do the studies, to do the code amendments, to do the like setting up a program for, any of your strategies that cost money, that cost you money, especially if it's planning work like code amendments. We very much hope to have those funds to be able to continue to give you grants to do this work. So we're not asking you to take on things that you can't afford. I think you can keep your fingers crossed and expect that you'll probably be able to get some sort of grant funding from DLCD, to implement some of these things over the next 8 years.
So Kelly, I'm going to take issue with one point you said, and that is that the gap between the current pricing for rentals and for new homes and that median target is so great that if we implement every one of these things, we are not going to hit that goal, with the exception of going into taxpayer-funded low-income housing business, which the city isn't set up or funded to do. So I appreciate that we can get the studies paid for, but actually making measurable results and moving us towards that goal, this is not going to do that. So you got to work harder at selling me on why we should spend a lot of time on this. Because nothing that we said faster doesn't make it cheaper. And maybe a little,
Yeah, I mean, I think our whole program kind of understands that cities you're not going to be building the housing, right? You're like,
let's talk about what does drive cost up, okay? Because when we went back to that graphic, in the middle of it was regulatory pressure. And in the middle of that, the comment from over here was, that's not a factor. Well, if you look at the regulatory changes for electrical codes from 10 years ago to now, it's added thousands of dollars to every unit that's constructed. So you want to fix things, start at the top, fix the code, and then we can build cheaper housing. But these studies, these plans, this isn't it. Sorry.
Yeah, I think to respond to that, I think it just the expectations are to tackle issues that are within your control, right? You don't control like the market, the bank loans, or building codes, right? That's a state. The state sets the building code, right? So the expectation is not that the city is going to be able to make big moves like that. That are not under your control. But that, anything that is under your control that maybe you can do to move the needle a little bit for some of these types of housing that are difficult to get built anywhere. But especially in a place like Sandy where, costs are high, your land's not cheap, and your infrastructure is not cheap. And, so those, really, we're focused on things that are in the control of the city, that are in the realm of municipal government.
I guess for context, I wanted to look at what the HCA I had. I looked up the draft that I had. And it's between 2023 and 2043, we were gonna need 24 dwelling units. Like 1,400 of those were single family detached. So then, there were 679 5+ unit dwellings. So we're not talking about, thousands and thousands of homes. We're talking about a couple thousand homes over the course of the next 19 years, given, where we're at. So I do see the HPS as being just a forecasting plan of action items to help deliver the state's objectives and what they're trying to achieve, whether or not they'll work or not, I don't know. So,
Fair.
I hear you, Don.
Okay, sorry, I'm done.
Beth or Kelly, I'm not sure who would best to address this question to, but is there a minimum number of strategies or approaches that the HPS should identify?
No, not that I've heard. I have seen cities put too many actions in their HPS. And so I encourage cities to look at 10 to 15 good actions. Unless you're a big city, like Eugene is gonna have a lot more actions than that, because they've got a lot more staff capacity.
It's 2 to 5, 2 to. That's 1 to 2 a year. Which, that's 1 or 2 projects a year. that you're-
And some of them will be smaller than others.
There's nothing small. I mean, the smallest thing we do takes 6 months to implement, it seems like.
So a city has choices about how many actions to
Small.
include.
You good?
I'm good with small, you know. No, sorry, I said I was done.
You guys have any?
One last question. Kelly, so when I see the housing the terms, the housing strategy report, is that right?
Housing production strategy.
For Westland and Lake Oswego, I just can imagine they hardly have any affordable housing and huge demand. I mean, so if they hardly have any, I would expect them, most of their needs is to start filling that gap.
They haven't done this yet.
So what I will say is that the ONA, the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, in a lot of ways, it's intended to correct some of that imbalance that you see. If you look at places like Troutdale and Gresham, what they're doing and the structure of the housing types, is it's really different than Westland or Lake Oswego or other places. And so I think what you'll see when you're doing your next housing capacity analysis and you look at the targets, and if you compare the targets for different metro cities, I think you're gonna see some expectations that are different for places like Lake Oswego and Westland.
Okay, well, I just, I was part of the 1997 2040 plan where we did it. We zoned a lot of high density and medium density and villages with mixed use and this and that. And we just, drank the Kool-Aid and just hit the ground running. And so then, what's happening, I feel like, is all this, push for even more when we were already, in the choir, singing the hymns. So it is a little bit frustrating to kind of have this, to see other places that have not done what we've done as far as having, a very good balance and range of densities, and then being pushed for even more densities. It's not what I was hoping for, I just want to maintain that balance in Sandy. That's my interest. So thank you, though. This has been very helpful to explain a lot of the objectives and possible strategies we could adopt. Thank you.
Anybody from planning have any questions? You guys are quiet.
We can send feedback to Kelly.
You can send it to Kelly or Jeff or myself, and we can filter it back to consultants.
Perfect.
Can we get it? I would love to hear their feedback.
Yeah, we can send it out to them.
Please.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll consolidate whatever feedback we get and then send it to the council as one set of documents.
Thank
that
you.
don't have a bunch of emails
Okay.
trickling in.
I know some of our commissioners were gonna follow up with the video that
Okay.
weren't able to be here.
Great.
Okay. Thanks, you
You-
guys.
Have what you
Do you have what you
need
need?
and expected from
Okay.
this evening? Okay,
Thank you.
perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Kelly.